Hey there, this video is going to be a short induction on how the EU makes laws and legislation. Here's a list of the institutions and bodies of the EU as laid out on the Institutions and Bodies page on the EU's website europa.eu. There's the European Parliament, the European Council, the Council of the European Union, the European Commission, the Court of Justice of the European Union, the European Central Bank, the European Court of Auditors, the European External Action Service, the European Economic and Social Committee, the European Committee of the Regions, the European Investment Bank, the European Ombudsman, the European Data Protection Supervisor, and the interinstitutional bodies. Now, the ones that actually make and pass laws are the European Parliament, the Council of the European Union, and the European Commission. Let's go through them. The European Parliament. This is where the MEPs go. MEP stands for Members of the European Parliament, in case you didn't know. The EU's website describes it as the EU's law-making body, which is only technically true, but we'll get to that. Obviously, the MEPs are directly elected by the people of each nation, which means these are the ones that the average person can affect. MEPs are grouped by political affiliation and ideology as opposed to by nation, which always works well and doesn't stifle productive discussion at all. The Parliament has three main roles: legislative, passing laws, deciding international agreements and enlargements, and begging the Commission to listen for a change; supervisory, a bunch of things that it doesn't care to do, and also electing the Commission President; and budgetary, establishing and approving the EU's budget. How Parliament works is in two stages. The committees are supposed to examine proposals for legislation and put forward amendments or propose to reject bills. The plenary sessions then vote on proposed legislation and amendments. Thanks to the Article 11 and 13 debacle, we now know that this isn't what actually happens. What seems to happen is a small section of the MEPs, usually Eurosceptics or conservative groups, will read the legislation and put forward amendments and propose to reject the bill, which is then all promptly ignored by the majority of MEPs who have never actually read the article in question and just have blind faith that the Commission isn't overreaching or working to serve corporate backers. I don't think I need to say any more on that subject, it speaks quite well enough for itself. The Council of the European Union. This one is possibly the least important in terms of the passing of legislation. That isn't to say they can't have an impact, just that they can't create legislation, nor are the members elected. Members of this council depend on the specific policy area being discussed. The members are government ministers from each EU country, and the presidency is rotated every 6 months. This group is basically the representative of the individual nations' governments, and are considered to have the responsibility of making sure that their country falls in line with the rulings of the EU as a whole. As such, they are there to negotiate terms, coordinate and develop policies, and conclude agreements with non-EU member states and foreign groups. They have the ability to block or pass legislation, with varying degrees of backing required for different areas of policy. The European Commission. The last and arguably most important group in the legislative process is the European Commission. The European Commission is the only group that proposes new laws. This means that the direction of the European Union and the laws it passes are at the sole discretion of the European Commission, and they can repeatedly attempt to pass through any and all blocked laws until they eventually get through without reprimand. Once elected, the Commission President elects an official from each nation state to be a commissioner, who then forms the European Commission. This means that as long as the majority of MEPs continue to staunchly refuse to perform their duties adequately, the European Commission President is, from the moment they are elected, the de facto ruler of the European Union for at least 5 years. As to my knowledge, there is no way to peaceably remove the President until their tenure is over. The Commission is the group that proposes new laws, manages policies, allocates funding, enforces laws, and represents the EU as a single bloc negotiating with other countries. As I'm sure you've probably worked out, I am not personally a fan of the EU. In fact, I do not believe the EU should exist. My reasoning for this can in part be explained by what I have just conveyed to you, the very mechanism by which the EU functions. If you think I've tried to mislead people in this video, go ahead and visit the site for yourselves. To the best of my knowledge, I believe I have conveyed the information in an accurate and concise enough manner to have a functional understanding of how laws are made within the EU and the parts each group involved play. I don't feel like I need to lie, I believe that the truth backs up my stance well enough. Thanks to everyone for watching. If you found this video informative and not too immeasurably dull, please share it with anyone you think may find it of some use, and leave a suggestion if there's anything you'd like me to try and explain in the future. I might not be able to do it, but I'll certainly try to try.